The courtroom was dead silent, except for the sound of a pen gliding over paper. Lila's heart raced, echoing loudly in her chest. The bright fluorescent lights above felt like they were closing in on her, pushing down on her shoulders with an unbearable weight. Everything about this moment screamed finality, and Lila could feel every inch of her body tensing with dread. She glanced over at Daniel, her soon-to-be ex-husband. His face was indifferent, cold, as if this entire divorce was nothing but a formality. His fingers moved across the legal documents in front of him, signing each page with mechanical precision. No hesitation, no emotion, just an almost casual dismissal of the 10 years they had spent together. A decade of their lives that now seemed so meaningless in his eyes. Lila wanted to say something. She wanted to shout, to scream at him for all the hurt, the betrayal, and the way he had treated her. But she couldn't. Her throat felt dry. The words stuck. He wasn't even looking at her. He wasn't even aware of the silent storm brewing inside her. With one final stroke of the pen, Daniel signed the last page. He didn't look up. He didn't even glance at Lila as he pushed the papers towards the judge, as if everything had already been decided, as if the life they had built together had already been erased. Lila felt a wave of nausea roll through her. She had always known that Daniel didn't love her, not truly, from the moment she had fallen for him. There had been something off, something cold about him. He was always charming, always attentive when he needed to be. But beneath it all, there was a hunger in him, a hunger that wasn't for her, but for the wealth her father had left her when he passed away. That had always been the truth, even when Lila had tried so hard to ignore it. Their love had been an illusion, a game, a well-played act, where Daniel had been the perfect husband and Lila had been the perfect trophy wife. But now, in the sterile courtroom, the curtain had fallen and the truth was undeniable. She could feel her father's absence like a physical ache in her chest. Her father had passed away 4 years ago, and although he had left her everything, the one thing he had never prepared her for was Daniel. He had never prepared her for a man like him, a man who was only interested in her for her inheritance, a man who would stop at nothing to control everything in her life. Lila tried to hold her emotions in check, but the weight of the moment was too much. She blinked rapidly, tried to push back the tears that threatened to fall. The sting of betrayal was almost unbearable. She had given him everything, her trust, her love, her loyalty, and he had discarded it like it meant nothing. A voice broke through her thoughts. "Are you sure you want to sign this, Lila?" Daniel asked, his tone dripping with mockery. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as if he were talking to someone beneath him. "I mean, it's not like you have much to hold on to now. You're not going to fight me on this, are you?" The words hit her like a slap to the face. How could he be so cruel? How could he be so heartless? The man she had married, the man she had once trusted, was now standing in front of her, belittling her in front of the entire courtroom. It was as if she was just a joke to him, a thing to be discarded when he was finished with it. Lila's hand trembled as she reached for the pen. She had known this day was coming, but now that it was here, it felt like she was drowning. She glanced at the papers, feeling a wave of anger and sorrow wash over her. It was a decision that had been forced upon her, a decision she hadn't made willingly. She had no choice. This was her reality now. This was her life. With a deep breath, she signed the papers. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was almost deafening. It felt like a final nail in the coffin of her marriage. But even as she signed, a part of her was angry. Angry at Daniel. Angry at herself for not seeing the truth sooner. She had let herself be fooled by his charm, by his promises, and now she was left with nothing. Her heart was broken, and her future was uncertain. Daniel slid the papers across the table to the judge without a second glance. He was done. He had won. He had what he wanted. And now it was over. The judge, a woman with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, took the papers and adjusted her seat. She glanced at both of them before speaking in a calm but firm voice. "Before we proceed," she said, looking directly at Lila, "there's something you need to know." Lila's heart skipped a beat. What was happening? She glanced at Daniel, whose smug expression hadn't faltered. He seemed to believe that this was just a formality, another step in the process that would make everything official. But something in the judge's tone, something in her demeanor, told Lila that this moment wasn't over. Not yet. Lila felt a sudden rush of anticipation, her breath catching in her throat. What was she about to hear? The air in the courtroom shifted, the weight of it pressing down on her like a thick fog. She could feel Daniel's eyes on her, but she didn't dare look at him. She was too focused on the judge, too focused on what was about to be revealed. The judge opened a file in front of her and began reading aloud from a document Lila had never seen before. The room seemed to grow quieter, the only sound the judge's steady voice as she began to speak. "This is your father's will, Lila," the judge said, her voice carrying across the room. "There is a clause in here that has not been read until now. It's a condition tied to your divorce." Lila's mind raced. What did this have to do with her father's will? She hadn't expected this. She hadn't even thought about the will since her father passed away. It had always been a part of her life, a part of her inheritance, but it was never something she had thought of as important. Not until now. Lila's breath caught in her throat as the judge continued reading, her words becoming more and more surreal. The will stipulates that upon Lila's divorce from Daniel, she is entitled to receive not just her inheritance, but a sum of money her father had specifically set aside to protect her from any future harm. The judge paused, her eyes meeting Lila's. This money will be transferred to her immediately, and Daniel will receive nothing. Lila felt her stomach drop. Was this real? Was this really happening? Her father had known. He had known what Daniel was like. He had known that Daniel would try to take everything from her. And so, he had set a trap, a safeguard. She looked over at Daniel, whose face had gone pale. His smug expression was gone, replaced with disbelief. His eyes flicked between Lila and the judge, his lips trembling slightly as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Lila wanted to smile. She wanted to laugh at the sight of his shock, at the look of confusion on his face. He had thought he had won. He had thought he had played her like a fool. But her father had seen it all. He had known what Daniel was capable of, and he had planned for this moment long before Lila had ever realized what was happening. The room seemed to close in on Daniel. The smugness in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a sharp, bitter anger. He had lost control. And now Lila had the power. She felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. It was as if everything had shifted in that one moment. Her father's who had given her the final weapon in this battle, and now she would use it. She wasn't going to let Daniel take everything from her. Not anymore. She met his gaze, her eyes steady and unflinching. Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was silent, his face flushed with rage. Lila felt a rush of relief, mixed with a deep sense of empowerment. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Daniel had underestimated her. And now, she was going to make him regret it. Daniel's fury was palpable. The courtroom, once a quiet place filled with formality, now felt like a battleground. His face had drained of all color, replaced by an intense flush of red that seemed to rise from the depths of his anger. He was visibly shaken, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the edges of the wooden table. Lila could feel the heat of his gaze on her, sharp and piercing. She had spent years trying to understand him, trying to see him the way she once had, the man she thought she had married. But now, with everything laid bare, she saw him for what he truly was. Someone who had never cared for her, someone who had always seen her as a means to an end. Her father's who had changed everything. It had stripped away Daniel's control over her, the last thread of power he had held over her life. He had underestimated her, and now, it was his turn to feel the sting of his own actions. Daniel stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with such force that it tipped over. The sound of it crashing to ground seemed to echo in the room, but no one moved. The judge remained silent, watching as Daniel paced in front of her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was a man who had built his life on manipulation, on control, and now he found himself standing in front of Lila, his world crashing down. "You think you've won, don't you?" Daniel's voice broke the silence, low and taunting. His words were sharp, like a knife aimed at her heart. "You think you're going to walk away with everything. But you're wrong, Lila. You'll never be able to get away from me. You'll regret this, I promise you." Lila took a deep breath. She could feel her heart racing, but there was no fear in her. Not anymore. The woman who had once been afraid of his words, of his dominance, was gone. The woman standing before him now was strong, resolute. She was no longer his wife. She was no longer his possession. She was free. She stood up from her seat slowly, meeting Daniel's gaze. Her eyes were steady, unwavering. She had lived her life in his shadow for far too long, had allowed his cruelty and manipulation to dictate her every move. But not anymore. You're wrong, Daniel, she said, her voice calm and controlled. I've been nothing to you for years. You've used me, belittled me, and treated me like I was nothing more than a stepping stone in your quest for power. But not anymore. I'm done living in your world. I'm done being controlled by you. Daniel's face twisted with disbelief. You think you're better than me, don't you? His words were laced with venom, his eyes narrowing. You think you can just walk away with everything, don't you? You'll regret this. I will make sure you regret it. Lila stood her ground, her heart steady. You're right about one thing, Daniel, she said quietly. I will never be the same. But not because of you. I won't regret a single thing. Not anymore. Daniel was furious now. His fists were clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. He stepped toward her, his face inches from hers, and for a moment, Lila could feel the heat of his anger radiating off of him. You'll be nothing without me, he hissed. You'll lose everything. You think you can just take it all from me and walk away, but you'll find out just how wrong you are. No one will ever want you, Lila. You'll be alone with nothing. But Lila wasn't afraid. She had heard those words too many times to let them hold any power anymore. They no longer had any weight. She had been alone in their marriage for years. She had lived in a house full of silence, surrounded by someone who had never truly loved her. She had endured endless nights of pretending, of trying to make herself believe that maybe, just maybe, Daniel would change. But now she knew he would never change. And she didn't need him to. I've already been alone, Daniel, she said softly, meeting his gaze with unwavering strength. I've been alone in this marriage for so long that I forgot what it felt like to truly live. But now I remember. I remember who I am, and I won't let you take that from me anymore. Daniel's face contorted in rage as he stepped back, his hands shaking. You won't get away with this, Lila, he muttered under his breath. You'll regret it. I'll make sure of it. Lila watched as he stormed out of the courtroom, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing in the now empty room. And for the first time in years, Lila felt a sense of relief wash over her. The weight of his presence, the constant fear, the self-doubt, it was all gone. She stood there for a moment, taking it all in, the freedom, the peace, the stillness of the room that had once felt like a prison. She was no longer his wife. She was no longer the woman he had tried to control. She was free. The judge spoke then, her voice soft but firm. This session is concluded, she said, and Lila nodded in acknowledgement, her heart still racing but now with a sense of triumph. She had won. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. There would be battles ahead. She knew that. Daniel wouldn't give up easily. But she was ready. She had her father's legacy, and she had the strength to protect it. As Lila walked out of the courtroom, she felt a sense of calm that she hadn't experienced in years. The air felt different, lighter somehow. For the first time in what seemed like forever, she didn't feel the crushing weight of Daniel's control over her. She stepped into the street and took a deep breath. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. It was as though the universe itself was offering her a fresh start, a new beginning. Lila didn't know exactly where her path would lead, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to walk it. She had everything she needed to start over. Her father's legacy, her courage, and a newfound strength that she had never known she possessed. As she drove home that evening, the wind from the open windows brushed against her face. The world outside had never seemed so full of possibility. She was free, and the future was hers to create. When she got home, she stood in front of the mirror, looking at herself as if seeing herself for the first time. The woman looking back at her was different. She had been through so much, endured so much pain, and yet here she was, standing strong and ready for whatever came next. Daniel had thought it could break her, but he had underestimated her. She was stronger than he ever knew, and she was going to prove it. This was her life now, and no one, not even him, would take it from her. She smiled at her reflection, a sense of peace settling over her. The journey ahead would be difficult, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. Lila stood at the window, her fingers tracing the edge of the glass as she stared out at the city skyline. The night was calm, the lights of the buildings below twinkling like stars scattered across the horizon. For the first time in years, the view didn't seem so distant. It felt close, accessible, like the future she had been too afraid to reach was finally within her grasp. She had left the courtroom that day with a sense of finality, the weight of Daniel's departure still fresh in her chest. His words had stung, but they had not broken her. They were hollow threats, desperate attempts to regain control over a situation he no longer held power in. She had taken back everything she had lost, and now it was time to build something of her own. But the truth was, Lila was still unsure what to do next. She had never been alone, not in the way she was now. For so many years, she had been defined by her relationship with Daniel. She had been his wife, his possession, the woman who existed only in relation to him. Now, as the weight of the past slowly lifted, Lila realized that she didn't know who she was anymore. She didn't know what it meant to be just herself. The house felt empty in a way it never had before. It had always been hers, but it had always been Daniel's too. It had been the place where she had been nothing more than a reflection of his success, the backdrop to his life. Now it was just her. She walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and pulled out a bottle of wine. The cold glass in her hand felt comforting, even if just for a moment. She poured herself a glass, sipping it slowly, trying to steady her thoughts. The silence of the house was almost overwhelming, but at the same time, it was peaceful. As she sat down at the table, her phone buzzed. A text from her lawyer. Lila's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for this news for days. The final papers from the divorce had been processed, but this message was something else entirely. She opened the text quickly, her fingers trembling as she read the words. The message confirmed what she had already suspected but hadn't yet fully understood. Her father's will, the one that had protected her from Daniel's greed, had one more surprise. It wasn't just about money. It was about something more, something that would change everything for her. According to the text, there was another clause in the will that had never been disclosed. A hidden fortune. A trust that her father had set aside for her long before she knew she would need it. A portion of her inheritance that would become available only now, after the divorce. The will had been written in such a way that it was impossible for Daniel to claim anything once the marriage was officially dissolved. The lawyer's message explained the trust in more detail. It was a sum that would set her free, a fortune that would allow her to live the life she had always dreamed of. It was enough to build a future without fear, without worrying about money or the hold Daniel had once had over her. Lila's mind raced as she read the message again, trying to process the magnitude of it all. This wasn't just about wealth. This was about power. This was the one thing Daniel hadn't counted on. The one thing that had been hidden from him. Her father had known. He had known that Daniel would try to take everything from her, and so he had set this in motion long before she ever realized it. Lila felt a strange sense of gratitude toward her father. Even though he was no longer there to guide her, he had loved her enough to protect her, even after his death. She put her phone down and looked around the room. Everything in this house, every possession, every corner, felt different now. It wasn't just a house. It was a home, a place she could finally claim for herself. The life she had once lived was gone, and in its place, there was a future full of possibilities. Lila took another sip of her wine, her mind still spinning. She had a lot of decisions to make. She needed to figure out what to do next. There was a trust to manage and the fortune her father had left her, but there was also something else she needed to confront. Daniel. He would be back. She knew that. He wasn't going to let her walk away so easily, but she was ready. She wasn't the same woman she had been when they first married. She was stronger now. She had fought for this freedom, and she wasn't going to let him take it from her. That night, as Lila lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the future. The possibilities seemed endless now, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of excitement rather than fear. She wasn't going to let anyone dictate her life again. She wasn't going to let anyone tell her who she was, or what she could or couldn't do. The next morning, Lila woke up with a new sense of purpose. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she was ready to face it head on. She had a plan, and for the first time, that plan was hers and hers alone. She got dressed quickly, her mind focused. There was work to do. The trust had to be managed, and there was still the matter of Daniel. She couldn't afford to ignore him, not when he would surely try to take everything from her. As she drove into the city, her phone rang. It was her lawyer again. Lila's heart raced as she answered the call. "I've made arrangements for you to meet with the financial advisors regarding the trust," the lawyer said. "We'll help you get everything in order, but you need to make sure you're fully prepared for what's coming next." Lila nodded, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "I've spent too long being afraid. It's time to take control." As she arrived at the office, Lila felt a surge of confidence she hadn't felt in years. She was no longer the woman who had been cowering in Daniel's shadow. She was no longer the woman who had been afraid of stepping out into the world on her own. She was stronger now, and she was ready to face whatever came next. Lila's days had fallen into a strange rhythm. The first few days after the court hearing were filled with a mix of excitement and exhaustion. She was free, or so she thought. She had taken the first step toward building the life she had always dreamed of. Her father's fortune, locked away in a trust, had become her lifeline. She could finally breathe, knowing that no matter what came next, she would not have to live in fear. Daniel was no longer a threat, at least not in the way he had been. She spent the next few days meeting with her lawyer and financial advisors, figuring out the next steps for her new life. She had never been interested in business before, but now she had to be. The money was hers to manage, her future in her hands, and the weight of that responsibility was both empowering and daunting. As the days passed, Lila found herself spending more time at home. She was cleaning out the house, going through old things, packing away memories. It was as if she needed to rid herself of the past in every possible way. She even considered selling the house, moving to a smaller place, something new, something that wouldn't remind her of the years spent in Daniel's shadow. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her lawyer. "Daniel is making moves. He's hiring a private investigator. You need to be careful." Lila stared at the message, her heart skipping a beat. She knew Daniel wasn't going to give up easily. He never did. But hiring a private investigator? That was a new level. She had thought that after the divorce, he would move on, find someone else, and let her go. She hadn't expected him to continue digging into her life after all that had happened. She typed a quick response. What does he want? What is he looking for? Her lawyer's reply came moments later. We don't know yet. He's trying to get information on your finances, your assets, anything he can use against you. This isn't over. Lila felt the familiar twinge of anxiety rise in her chest, but she pushed it down. She had been through too much to let fear take hold again. She had her father's fortune, and she wasn't about to let Daniel take that from her. Not now. Not ever again. But Daniel's persistence was something she hadn't anticipated. He had always been calculating, always playing the long game. Now it seemed he wasn't finished with her just yet. Lila couldn't afford to be complacent. She had to stay ahead of him. She couldn't let him get to her, couldn't let him find a way back into her life. She had worked too hard to get to this point, to claim her independence. She wasn't going to let him destroy everything she had built. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and careful planning. Lila knew she had to be smart about this. She couldn't let Daniel see her sweat. She couldn't let him know how much he still scared her, how much his threats still haunted her, even now. But Lila wasn't just going to sit back and wait for Daniel to make his move. She was going to take control. She was going to fight back. Lila made an appointment with a private investigator of her own. She needed to know exactly what Daniel was up to, what kind of dirt he was trying to dig up. She couldn't afford to be blindsided by anything. Her future depended on it. The private investigator was a woman named Claire. She was sharp, no nonsense, and had a reputation for getting results. Lila explained the situation to her. Daniel's relentless pursuit, his desire to control everything she had, and Claire nodded. taking notes as Lila spoke. "We'll find out what he's after," Claire said, her voice steady and reassuring. "I'll get my team on it. We'll make sure he doesn't have a chance to hurt you again." Lila felt a sense of relief wash over her, knowing that she wasn't alone in this fight. She didn't have to do everything herself. She could trust someone else to help her navigate the storm. That was Daniel. A few days later, Claire called. Lila answered immediately, her heart racing with anticipation. "We've got a lead," Claire said, her voice serious. "Daniel's been trying to track your movements. He's been keeping an eye on your property, watching where you go, who you meet. But it's not just that. He's also been looking into your financial records. He's trying to find a way to challenge the trust your father set up for you." Lila clenched her fists, her anger rising. She had known Daniel wouldn't just walk away, but this was something else. He had crossed a line. "What else has he been doing?" Lila asked, her voice tight with emotion. "He's trying to get information from your bank. He's trying to find any legal loophole he can use to take control of the trust. He's not going to stop, Lila. Not until he has everything." Lila's mind raced. She had known that Daniel wouldn't let go easily, but now she realized just how far he was willing to go. This wasn't just about the money. This was about power, about control, about breaking her. But Lila wasn't going to let him win. Not now, not ever. She had fought too hard to get here. She wasn't going to lose it all because Daniel couldn't accept the truth. She was done with him. The days following Claire's call were filled with tension. Lila spent hours on the phone with her lawyer, discussing the next steps, making sure her financial records were secure, and ensuring that Daniel couldn't find a way to manipulate the situation. She also took extra precautions, changing the locks on her doors, installing security cameras, and making sure her movements were protected. She had worked hard for this life. She wasn't going to let Daniel take it from her. He had used her for years, used her father's wealth to build his empire, but now she was the one in control. She had the power, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. But the tension was getting to her. She could feel it in her bones, in the way her hands would shake when she answered the phone. In the sleepless nights, she spent wondering what Daniel was plotting next. The uncertainty, the fear of the unknown, it gnawed at her. But she refused to let it take hold. She was stronger than that. She had to be. It was a week later when the final bombshell came. Lila was in her office, sorting through some papers when her lawyer called. "Lila, you need to prepare yourself. We got a serious issue. Daniel's been working behind the scenes to get a court order that would allow him to challenge the will. He's claiming that your father wasn't in the right state of mind when he made the trust. He's trying to prove that your father was coerced." Lila's stomach dropped. She had known Daniel would fight, but this was a new level of underhanded. He was trying to tarnish her father's legacy, trying to destroy the one thing that had protected her all these years. "Is this going to work?" Lila asked, her voice shaking. "No," the lawyer replied firmly, "but it's going to take time to clear it up. We'll need to gather evidence to prove your father's mental state when the trust was created. It's going to be a long process." Lila let out a long breath. This was it. This was the fight she had been preparing for. And she was ready. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to let Daniel take everything from her now. Lila sat in her office, looking out at the city below. The world outside seemed to be moving so fast, but in her heart, she felt something else, an unshakable resolve. She had fought for this life. She had fought for her freedom, and she wasn't going to lose it. Not to Daniel, not to anyone. She was stronger than she had ever been. And now, the real battle was about to begin. Lila sat quietly in her office, her fingers drumming rhythmically on the desk as the phone call ended. The weight of her lawyer's words still lingered in her mind, but she wasn't about to let them shake her. Not now. She had come too far, fought too hard, to let Daniel's schemes take everything she had worked for. The trust her father had left her was a safeguard, but now it was becoming the very thing Daniel wanted to tear down. He had always been a man who sought control, who believed that power over others was his birthright. But what Daniel didn't understand was that Lila was no longer the woman he could manipulate. She was stronger than he had ever given her credit for, and she was willing to do whatever it took to protect her future. The lawyer's voice had been calm, But Lila could hear the undercurrent of concern. Daniel had already filed a motion to contest the will, arguing that her father had been coerced into making the trust. It was a claim that was as laughable as it was dangerous. Lila's father had been sharp and clear-headed until his very last day. The notion that he had been anything but in control of his decisions was not just insulting. It was a deliberate attack on his legacy. But Lila wasn't going to let that stand. She couldn't. She looked out the window, watching the sun set over the city. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and decisions that she never thought she'd have to make. It was overwhelming at times, but with each passing day, she felt more and more in control. She had the means to fight back. She had the resources. And more than that, she had a determination that came from deep within, from a place she didn't even know existed until now. She wasn't going to let Daniel tear apart the last remnants of her father's love and protection. She had been raised with the knowledge that nothing in life was ever handed to you without a fight. And now, it was her turn to fight. The next day, Lila met with Claire, the private investigator. They had already uncovered a few troubling details about Daniel's movements, and now, it was time to dig deeper. Claire had proven to be an invaluable ally. She had the skills, the experience, and the grit needed to take on Daniel's manipulation. "I've got some new information," Claire said as Lila entered her office. "Daniel's been doing more than just filing motions in court. He's been making calls. Lots of calls. One of his connections at the bank seems to be feeding him information about your account, about the trust. He's trying to find any little loophole he can exploit." Lila clenched her jaw. "I thought we had secured everything." "We did," Claire replied, "but Daniel is ruthless. He's looking for anything he can use, and he's not stopping. We need to stay ahead of him." Lila nodded. "What do we need to do next?" "We'll need to track his communications," Claire said, pulling up a list of names and numbers on her computer screen. "We have a few contacts who can help us gather intel on his network. We can't let him get any closer to your financial records." Lila's pulse quickened. Every move Daniel made felt like a chess piece being shifted, a silent war being waged behind closed doors. But she wasn't going to be a passive player anymore. She was done being at the mercy of his manipulations. "I'm ready," Lila said, her voice steady. The following weeks were filled with a whirlwind of activity. Lila kept her head down, focusing on the task at hand, making sure her finances were secure, coordinating with Claire, and preparing for the legal battle ahead. She spent hours with her lawyer, gathering evidence that would prove her father's intentions were clear, that he had been in full control when he made the trust. Daniel's claim was flimsy, but it had to be taken seriously. No matter how ridiculous his accusations were, they still had to be met with solid evidence. Lila found herself spending more time at her father's old office, sorting through documents, finding old correspondence, and gathering anything that might show the strength of her father's mind when he made the decisions regarding her inheritance. Her father had been methodical. Every document was carefully filed, every decision tracked. The evidence was all there. She just had to put together. One late night, after hours of sorting through boxes, Lila found something that made her heart race. It was an old letter her father had written, addressed to Lila. It was dated just a few months before his death. In the letter, her father explained the reasoning behind the trust and the protections he had put in place for her. He had written about his love for her, about his desire to ensure her safety, and about how he knew Daniel's true nature. He had known everything Daniel was capable of, and he had prepared for it. Tears welled up in Lila's eyes as she read the final paragraph. Her father's words were clear, his love for her unwavering. She knew, without a doubt, that her father had made these decisions with the utmost care, with the intention protecting her from everything Daniel had tried to take from her. She carefully folded the letter and tucked it into a file. This was the piece of evidence that would put Daniel's claim to rest. She had everything she needed. Now it was time to fight. The legal proceedings were tense. Lila sat in the courtroom, her hands clasped in front of her as her lawyer presented the evidence. She felt the weight of her father's legacy on her shoulders, the responsibility of making sure Daniel could not destroy everything he had left behind. Daniel sat across from her, his expression cold and defiant. He had hired an expensive legal team, and they were doing everything they could to poke holes in the trust. But Lila remained calm. She knew the truth. She knew her father's intentions, and she wasn't about to let anyone twist them. The judge listened carefully to both sides, but Lila could tell she was not impressed with Daniel's arguments. They were weak. They had no substance. And Lila had the proof to back up her claims. The day ended with no verdict, but Lila felt a sense of relief. This was the first battle in what would likely be a long war, but she knew she was winning. That evening, as Lila sat in her office, she received a call from Claire. "Lila," Claire said, her voice tense. "We've got some news. Daniel's making his final move. He's planning something big. We don't know what yet, but he's going all in. You need to prepare yourself." Lila's heart raced. "What do you mean, something big?" "I can't say for sure, but he's desperate," Claire replied. "He's pulling all his strings now. You need to stay ahead of him." Lila took a deep breath, her mind spinning. She had known Daniel wouldn't back down easily, but this was more than she had anticipated. He was playing for everything now. The stakes were higher than ever, but Lila was ready. She had the truth on her side, and she wasn't about to let him win. Lila's world felt like it was spinning out of control. The days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and legal documents that seemed to multiply overnight. Every time she thought she had a moment to breathe, another challenge would rise to meet her. Daniel wasn't going to make this easy. She had known that from the start, but it was becoming clearer than ever just how far he was willing to go to maintain his hold on her life. The news from Claire had shaken her, but it also solidified her resolve. Daniel was pulling out all the stops now, desperate and determined to take back what he thought was his. But Lila wasn't going to let him win. Not now. Not after everything she had fought for. She stood in front of the large window in her office, looking out at the city. The view was the same, but she no longer felt trapped by it. It was hers now. She had fought for it, and she was going to protect it. The life she was building was her own, and she wasn't going to let Daniel take it from her. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was her lawyer again. She quickly answered, her heart racing. "We need to meet," her lawyer said, his voice tense. "Daniel's making a move. He's pushing for a hearing to invalidate the trust. He's claiming that the documents weren't signed properly. He's trying to create doubt." Lila's breath caught in her throat. This was the move she had been waiting for. The final attempt to tear down her father's legacy and take everything from her. Daniel wasn't going to stop. He had never planned on letting her walk away with the wealth her father had left her. "Is it serious?" Lila asked, her voice steady but full of urgency. "It's serious," the lawyer replied. "We need to prepare. We have to counter this quickly. If we don't, he could get a court order that can invalidate the entire trust. It's a game changer." Lila's stomach tightened. "How long do we have?" "Less than a week. We need everything lined up. We're going to fight this with everything we've got. But I need you to be prepared for a tough battle." Lila nodded, even though her lawyer couldn't see her. "I'm ready. Let's do it." The meeting with her lawyer the next day was grueling. Every question felt like another wall being put up in front of her, but Lila wasn't deterred. She had already been through the worst of it. She had faced Daniel's manipulations for years, and now she was finally in a position where she could fight back. The lawyer outlined their strategy. They would gather more evidence to counter Daniel's claim, proving that the trust had been signed properly and was legally binding. But that wasn't enough. They needed to prove Daniel's true intentions to show that this wasn't just about a legal technicality. It was about power, about control, about a man who would stop at nothing to take what he thought was his. "We'll need witnesses," her lawyer said. "We need to find people who can speak to your father's mental state, who can testify to his intentions. We need people who can speak to your father's relationship with Daniel, and how Daniel always tried to manipulate him." Lila nodded, her mind racing. She already knew who she could call. Her father had surrounded himself with people who respected him, who knew the truth about his strength and clarity of mind. She had to dig deep and find them, and she had to do it fast. "Start calling them," the lawyer instructed. "We need them on our side. This could be the most important part of the case." The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and preparations. Lila reached out to every person she could think of who had known her father well. She spoke with old friends of his, former colleagues, and even people who had worked closely with him in his later years. They all spoke of the man Lila had known, sharp, clear-headed, and unwavering in his decisions. They had seen him in his prime, and they could all testify that he had been in full possession of his faculties when he made the decisions about the trust. As the days passed, the pressure began to mount. Every conversation, every piece of evidence gathered, only added more weight to the situation. Daniel was relentless. He had thrown everything he could at her, and Lila knew that he wouldn't stop until he had destroyed everything her father had left her. But Lila wasn't going to let that happen. She couldn't. She had already lost too much. She had already given up her life for too long. She had spent years being controlled by Daniel, by his demands, by his expectations. But now, she was the one in control. She had the strength to fight back, and she was going to use it. The hearing came faster than Lila had expected. She walked into the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. The last time she had been in this room, it had felt like the end of everything. It had felt like she was walking away with nothing. But now it felt different. She was here to fight. She was here to reclaim everything that had been taken from her. Daniel was already seated, his usual smug expression firmly in place. He didn't seem worried, didn't seem like he even considered that he could lose. But Lila could see the cracks. She could see the desperation in his eyes. He was afraid. He was terrified that he was losing control. Lila sat down at her lawyer's side, her hands resting calmly on the table. She knew that this wasn't just about the trust. This was about more than money. This was about her father's legacy. This was about her freedom. And she wasn't going to let Daniel destroy that. The judge called the session to order, and the battle began. As the hearing progressed, Lila listened closely to the arguments being made. Daniel's legal team was trying their best to poke holes in the trust, but every time they spoke, Lila could feel her resolve strengthening. Her lawyer presented the evidence they had gathered, the witnesses who had come forward. The documents that proved her father's intentions were clear. They had prepared everything they could, and they were presenting it flawlessly. Daniel's team, on the other hand, seemed desperate. They were grasping at straws, trying to convince the judge that the trust was invalid, that it was a result of coercion, that her father had not been in full control of his faculties. But Lila knew better. Her father had been sharp, had been clear. He had made these decisions with love, with care, and with the intention of protecting his daughter. The final argument was made, and the judge adjourned the session. Lila sat back in her chair, her heart still racing. The tension in the room was palpable. She had no idea what the outcome would be, but she knew one thing for sure. She had given it everything she had. She had fought with everything in her power, and now it was up to the judge. That evening, as Lila drove home, the weight of the day's events hung heavy on her shoulders. She had done everything she could, and now all she could do was wait. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't afraid of Daniel or his threats. She wasn't afraid of losing. She had already lost so much. But what she had gained was more valuable than anything money could buy. She had gained her strength, her independence, and her future. As she entered her home, the silence greeted her again. But this time, it wasn't suffocating. It was peaceful. It was hers. She had earned it. She had fought for it. And no one was going to take it away. Lila's life had always been filled with structure. There was comfort and routine in the order of things. But ever since Daniel had entered the picture, her life had become a series of shifts and turns, each more unpredictable than the last. Now, with the trust hanging in the balance and the court hearing just days away, she felt like she was caught in the middle of a storm. Her father had set everything in motion, ensuring her safety and securing her future. But Daniel had been relentless. She thought the trust had been her shield. But now, with his private investigator digging into her past and his legal team throwing everything they could at her, it felt like the ground beneath her was slipping. The call from her lawyer had come early that morning, shattering the brief calm she had tried to hold on to. Daniel was pushing for a temporary injunction, attempting to freeze all assets in the trust until the court could rule. This was not a move Lila had expected. She knew he would fight, he had always fought, but this was desperation. Lila could feel the weight in her chest as she walked out her office, the phone still clutched in her hand. The street outside was bustling with people, each one going about their business, oblivious to the war that was being waged in a courtroom. But Lila was not oblivious. She was fighting for everything her father had left her. She was fighting for her life, for her future, and for the right to live without the constant shadow of Daniel's manipulation. As she walked toward her car, the world around her seemed to slow. The honking of horns, the chatter of passers-by, all of it faded into the background. It was as if she had entered a new world, a world where the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. Lila sat at her kitchen table that evening, her hands resting on the paperwork that had been delivered to her just hours ago. The details were overwhelming. The injunction Daniel was requesting was not just about halting the trust, it was about control. It was about him regaining the power he had lost when the divorce was finalized. He was trying to force her hand, trying to make her give up, trying to take back everything he had once had a claim on. Her mind raced as she went over the documents again. She had been prepared for many things, an ongoing fight, legal tactics, and even personal attacks. But this was different. This was Daniel showing his true nature, desperate, willing to destroy everything in his path to get what he wanted. Lila leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. She had spent so much time fighting against him, but she knew that her fight wasn't just against Daniel. It was against a system that could so easily be manipulated, against the wealth and power he wielded with such ease. She had seen how quickly the world could turn a blind eye to the truth when money and influence were at play. And despite everything she had done, despite the evidence, despite her father's will, she still didn't know what the judge's decision would be. She picked up the phone and dialed her lawyer's number, her fingers shaking slightly. The line rang a few times before he picked up. "Lila," he said, his voice tired but steady. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," she replied, her voice more confident than she felt. I just need to know if we're ready for the final hearing." "We're ready," he said, but Lila could hear the hesitation in his voice. "I've gone over everything with my team. We have the evidence we need. Your father's mental state is clear. The witnesses are solid, and the documents are all in order. But I can't lie to you, Lila. The odds are not in our favor. Daniel's team is going to put up one hell of a fight." Lila's heart sank. She had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud was another thing entirely. "Is it serious?" Lila asked, her voice steady but full of urgency. "It's serious," the lawyer replied. "We need to prepare. We have to counter this quickly. If we don't, he could get a court order that could invalidate the entire trust. It's a game changer." Lila's stomach tightened. "He can't do that. He can't take it from me." "He's trying," her lawyer replied. "But we're going to fight him. We have a solid case. We just need to stay the course. I'll be in touch soon with the details for the hearing. Just stay strong, Lila." The call ended, and Lila sat in silence for a moment. She stared at the papers in front of her, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. It wasn't just about the money, not anymore. It was about her father's legacy, her independence, and her ability to protect what was hers. She had come so far, but she wasn't about to give up now. She stood up from the desk and walked to the window, staring out at the city. The view was the same, but she no longer felt trapped by it. It was hers now. She had fought for it, and she was going to protect it. The life she was building was her own, and she wasn't going to let Daniel take it from her. The phone buzzed again. It was Claire, the private investigator. "We've got something. Daniel's lawyer has been in contact with a financial advisor at your bank. They're trying to find any loopholes in the trust documents." Lila's stomach twisted. It wasn't just the law he was playing with now. It was her future, her family's legacy. They were digging, searching for cracks that didn't exist. But Claire's words meant one thing. Daniel was prepared to go all the way. "Keep an eye on them," Lila responded, her voice tight. "We can't afford to let him get anything." "You'll be the first to know," Claire replied. "But be ready. He's coming for everything." That night, Lila sat alone in her father's old study, the room dimly lit by a single desk lamp. She had spent countless hours here as a child, watching her father work, asking questions, learning from him in the quiet of this space. It had always been a place of safety for her, a place of wisdom. But now it felt different. Now, it felt like the final battlefield. The walls seemed to close in on her, the weight of everything pressing down. She thought about Daniel, about how he had worked so tirelessly to make her believe she was nothing without him. He had almost succeeded. Almost. But now, with the trust secured, with her father's love and protection surrounding her, Lila felt like she had a chance to fight back. She wasn't going to back down. She couldn't. She had fought for too long, for too much, to let him take it all now. The day of the final hearing arrived, and Lila was ready. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her jacket, taking one last look at her reflection. This wasn't just about the money, the trust, or even Daniel. This was about her life. This was about taking control of her future, of building something for herself that no one could take away. She had spent years living in someone else's shadow, but now, the light was hers to claim. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Lila walked in, her head held high, her gaze steady. Daniel was already there, sitting across from her with his usual smug expression. But she wasn't going to let that intimidate her. Not now. Lila's lawyer stood next to her, ready to present their case. They had gathered everything they needed, testimony, evidence, and witnesses. The truth was on their side. They had to make sure the judge saw it. The hearing began, and Daniel's lawyer immediately launched into his argument. He was smooth, convincing, but Lila could see the cracks in his words. He was desperate. Try and make something out of nothing. But she knew the truth, and she wasn't going to let him twist it. As the hearing continued, Lila felt a quiet confidence settle within her. Every question, every piece of evidence that was presented, solidified her belief in her case. Daniel's lies were starting to unravel, and she could feel the tide turning in her favor. By the end of the day, Lila knew it wasn't over yet. The judge had to deliberate, and the waiting was the hardest part. But she had done everything she could. She had fought with everything she had, and now it was in the hands of the law. Later that evening, Lila sat in her car, parked on a quiet street. The silence was soothing, a momentary break from the chaos. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day lift slightly. But the battle wasn't over. Daniel was still out there, still plotting, and she wasn't about to let her guard down. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, a moment to realize that no matter what happened in the end, she had already won. She had found the strength to stand up for herself, to fight for the life she deserved. And that was something no one, not even Daniel, could take from her. Lila awoke early that morning. The quiet stillness of the house surrounding her like a heavy blanket. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. She could hear the distant hum of traffic outside, the sound of the world waking up. But for her, the world felt suspended. Today was the day that would determine the rest of her life. She had been through so much to get to this point. The fight for her father's legacy, for her own independence, had taken everything she had. Every moment of the last few months had been a battle, but it was all leading to this. The hearing was over. The arguments had been made, and now, the only thing left to do was wait for the judge's decision. Lila stood up from the bed, stretching her arms above her head, trying to shake off the weight of the moment. She walked to the window and looked out at the city below. It had always been a place of dreams for her, a place full of promise and potential. But today it felt different. Today, it felt like the city was watching her, waiting for the same thing. She was waiting for the decision that would change everything. She had always been a woman of patience. But this was different. This was the culmination of years of struggle. Years of living under Daniel's shadow. Years of believing that she couldn't stand on her own. But now, with everything she fought for on the line, she wasn't sure she could wait another minute. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up quickly, her heart racing. It was her lawyer. She took a deep breath and answered, her voice steady. I know, he said, his voice calm but strained. I want to call you first before the official announcement. The judge has reached a decision. Lila's breath caught in her throat. What is it? What did the judge decide? There was a pause on the other end, a moment of silence that seemed to stretch on forever. They ruled in your favor. The lawyer finally said, The trust stands. Daniel's claims have been dismissed. You're free, Lila. It's over. Lila let out the breath she didn't know she had been holding, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done it. She had won. She didn't know how long she stood there, the phone pressed her ear, her mind racing. It felt surreal. After all the fighting, all the late nights spent preparing, all the sacrifices, it was over. The trust was hers. Her father's legacy was intact, and Daniel had lost. I can't believe it, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's really over. It's over, the lawyer confirmed. I'll send you the official paperwork, but for now, you can breathe. You've won, Lila. You've proven everyone wrong. Lila sat down on the edge of her bed, her mind still processing the news. She had fought so hard for this, but it still felt impossible to believe. The last few months had been filled with tension and uncertainty, but now, in the quiet aftermath, she felt a sense of peace settling in. She had done it. She had reclaimed her life. She thought about everything she had gone through to get here, the constant struggle to free herself from Daniel's control, the endless paperwork, the long hours spent preparing for the legal battle. And through it all, she had kept moving forward, determined not to let anything stand in her way. And now, she had won. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Claire, the private investigator who had been working with her throughout the case. I just heard the news. Congratulations. You did it. Daniel's furious, but he can't do anything now. You're free. Lila smiled at the message, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. Claire had been there from the beginning, helping her navigate the complexities of the legal system, gathering information, and making sure Daniel couldn't pull any tricks. She was a trusted ally in a fight that had often felt isolating. Thank you, Lila replied, her fingers tapping out the words on the screen. I couldn't have done it without you. Lila spent the rest of the morning reflecting on everything that had happened. The fight was over, but it didn't feel like an end. It felt like a beginning. The future stretched out before her, and for the first time in years, she could see it clearly. It was hers to shape, and no one could take that away from her. She made her way downstairs and poured herself a cup of coffee, the warmth of the mug a comforting reminder that life was moving forward. She had won. The next step was hers to take, and she wasn't going to waste any more time. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She wasn't expecting anyone, but when she opened the door, she found a bouquet of flowers waiting for her, tied with a simple note. She smiled as she read the message. You did it. Proud of you. Claire. Lila held the bouquet to her chest for a moment, the weight of the gesture reminding her of how far she had come. She had won, but she had also gained something more valuable than money or power. She had gained her independence, her strength, and the confidence to step into the future without fear. The next few days were filled with a quiet celebration. Lila didn't throw a grand party or tell the world of her victory. Instead, she spent time in her home, savoring the feeling of peace that had finally settled in her heart. She spent hours on the phone with her lawyer, confirming the details of the ruling, making sure everything was final. Daniel's reaction, as expected, was swift. He had appealed the decision, but it was clear that he had no ground to stand on. His attempts to fight back were weak, and his legal team had already given up. He had lost. And for once, it felt like justice had been served. But even with the victory, Lila knew that there would be challenges ahead. The battle had been long and hard, but it had made her stronger. She had proven to herself and to the world that she was capable of standing on her own. She had reclaimed her father's legacy, and now she was ready to build her own future. A week after the ruling, Lila stood on the balcony of her home, looking out over the city. The view had never looked so beautiful, so full of possibility. The future was wide open, and for the first time, Lila felt free. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from her lawyer. Final paperwork is in. The trust is officially yours. Daniel is out of the picture. You've done it, Lila. Lila smiled, setting the phone down. It was done. Daniel had been a part of her life for far too long, and now he was nothing more than a distant memory. She had won. She had taken control of her life. And now, the future was hers to shape. She walked inside, picking up the bouquet from Claire and placing it on the table. The flowers were a symbol of everything she had fought for, everything she had won. She had proven that no one, not even Daniel, could take what was rightfully hers. The next few months were a blur of new beginnings. Lila worked with financial advisors, making sure the trust was properly managed and that her future was secure. She had always been good at handling money, but now, with everything in her control, she felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. She made plans to travel, to see the world and experience life without the weight of her past holding her back. She reached out to old friends, reconnecting with the people who had been there for her before Daniel came into her life. She was finally living a life she had always wanted, a life built on her terms. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Lila finally felt like she was home. She had fought for her freedom. She had fought for her father's legacy. And now, she was free to live the life she had always dreamed of. The sun was rising over the city, casting a soft golden light through the curtains in Lila's bedroom. She awoke slowly, stretching her arms and letting the warmth of the morning settle around her. It had been months since the hearing, since the day she had won everything. And now, everything felt different. The weight that had once anchored her to the past was gone. The future was wide open, waiting for her to take the first step. She sat up in bed and looked out the window. The city below was alive with energy, a constant hum of activity that felt distant and yet somehow familiar. She had always loved this view, but now it felt like a symbol of her newfound freedom. She wasn't just looking at the city anymore. She was looking at her future, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was walking in someone else's shadow. The phone buzzed on a nightstand, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up and saw that it was a message from her lawyer. The final documents of the trust have been processed. Everything is officially in your name. Congratulations again. You've made it through. Lila smiled to herself, feeling a sense of satisfaction settle in her chest. It wasn't just about the money, not anymore. It was about the fact that she had taken control of her life. She had fought for her future, for her independence, and now it was finally hers. She stood up and walked to the window, taking in a view of the city one last time before getting ready for the day. There was still so much to do, so many decisions to make, but now they were hers to make. She could finally move forward without the constant fear of Daniel lurking in the background. Lila spent the next few days focusing on herself. She had been so consumed with the legal battle for so long that she hadn't really taken time to think about what she wanted for her life. She had always been a caretaker, always worried about others, but now it was time to focus on herself. She started small, picking up new hobbies, things she had always wanted to try but had never had the time or energy for. She began painting again, something she hadn't done since she was a child. She had always loved art, but it had been pushed aside for so many years. Now, it was a way for her to express herself, to let out everything that had been bottled up inside her for so long. She also started working on new business ventures, setting up a foundation to help others who had been in situations like hers, people who had been controlled and manipulated. She knew how important it was to have a voice, to be able to speak out and make a difference. And with her new financial freedom, she could do just that. But even as she focused on her own growth, the memories of her time with Daniel lingered. They were still there, faint echoes in her mind. The hurt, the betrayal, the way he had used her. It was hard to forget, but Lila knew she couldn't let those memories control her anymore. She had to move forward, to embrace the person she was becoming. One evening, as she sat in her living room, staring at the fireplace, Lila received a call. It was Claire, the private investigator who had been with her from the beginning. "We've been keeping an eye on Daniel," Claire said, her voice calm but serious. "He's been making some moves behind the scenes, trying to rally support for a final push. He hasn't given up, but we're on top of it. He won't get to you." Lila's heart skipped a beat. She had known it wasn't over. Daniel would never just let things go. But hearing it from Claire, hearing that he was still scheming, was a reminder that her fight wasn't fully over. "I'm not afraid of him anymore," Lila said, her voice steady. "He's lost. He knows it. I'm not going to let him have any more of my life. Claire paused for a moment. I know you're strong, Lila, but just be careful. He's unpredictable. Don't let your guard down. Lila nodded, even though Claire couldn't see her. I won't. Thanks, Claire. As the call ended, Lila sat back in her chair, deep in thought. She had won the battle, but she knew Daniel wasn't finished. He had never been one to accept defeat. But this time, Lila wasn't afraid. This time, she had the power, and she would make sure he couldn't take it from her. The next day, Lila spent hours at her father's old office, sorting through papers and taking inventory of everything he had left behind. The building was quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights above the only sound in the room. She had always felt a sense of peace here, but today it felt different. The office no longer belonged to her father. It belonged to her now. She opened one of the cabinets, pulling out a stack of files and going through them one by one. Her father had been meticulous, and everything was carefully documented. There were letters, contracts, and records of every business deal he had ever made. She had known that her father had been a successful man, but seeing it all laid out in front of her made it clear just how much he had accomplished in his lifetime. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the legacy he had left for her. He had given her everything she needed to succeed, everything she needed to build her own life. She just had to take it, to accept it, and to move forward. She had been given the tools. Now it was time to build something with them. The days passed quickly, and soon it was time for Lila to make some big decisions. She met with her lawyer again to finalize the trust details and make sure everything was secure. She also continued working with her financial advisors, ensuring that her investments were sound and that her future was secure. But even as she focused on the practical aspect of her new life, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. The victory over Daniel, the legal battles, the money, it was all important, but there was still an emptiness inside her. She had gained so much. But what was it all for if she couldn't find peace within herself? One evening, after a long day of meetings, Lila decided to take a walk. The cool night air felt refreshing as she stepped outside, the sounds of the city surrounding her. She walked down the street aimlessly, not really knowing where she was going, but needing the time to clear her mind. As she walked, she thought about the past. She thought about the years spent with Daniel, the years spent trying to live up to his expectations. She thought about the way he had controlled every aspect of her life, and how she had let it happen. She had been weak then, afraid, but now she was strong, and she wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Daniel, control her again. Lila stopped by a small park and sat on one of the benches, the stillness of the night settling around her. The moon was full, casting a silver glow over the trees and grass. It was peaceful here. It was a place she could finally breathe, a place where she could just be herself. The following week, Lila received another message from her lawyer. This time, it wasn't about Daniel or the case. It was about her future. The final paperwork was ready to be signed, and everything was officially settled. Lila was free, completely free. She stood up from the chair, her heart racing as she realized the significance of it all. She had fought for this, had worked for this moment for so long, and now it was finally hers. She had the freedom to live her life the way she wanted, to build her future on her terms. No one could take that from her. With the paperwork signed and everything officially in place, Lila made a decision. She would sell the house. The mansion that had once held so many memories, so much pain, was no longer her home. It had been a symbol of her life with Daniel, and now she was ready to move on. She called her real estate agent and began the process. The house would be gone, but she would have the freedom to build something new, something that was truly hers. As the final chapter in her battle with Daniel came to a close, Lila felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had won, but more than that, she had reclaimed herself. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in her life, she was in control. She was ready to write her own story. Lila woke early that morning, the quiet stillness of the house surrounding her like a heavy blanket. The sunlight filtered to the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. She could hear the distant hum of traffic outside, the sound of the world waking up, but for her, the world felt suspended. Today was the day that would determine the rest of her life. She had been through so much to get to this point. The fight for her father's legacy, for her own independence, had taken everything she had. Every moment of the last few months had been a battle, but it was all leading to this. The hearing was over. The arguments had been made, and now, the only thing left to do was wait for the judge's decision. Lila stood up in bed and looked out the window. The city below was alive with energy, a constant hum of activity that felt distant and yet somehow familiar. She had always loved this view, but now it felt like a symbol of her newfound freedom. She wasn't just looking at the city anymore. She was looking at her future, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was walking in someone else's shadow. The phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up and saw that it was a message from her lawyer. The final documents for the trust have been processed. Everything is officially in your name. Congratulations again. You've made it through. Lila smiled to herself, feeling a sense of satisfaction settle in her chest. It wasn't just about the money, not anymore. It was about the fact that she had taken control of her life. She had fought for her future, for her independence, and now it was finally hers. She stood up and walked to the window, taking in the view of the city one last time before getting ready for the day. There was still so much to do, so many decisions to make, but now they were hers to make. She could finally move forward without the constant fear of Daniel lurking in the background. Lila spent the next few days focusing on herself. She had been so consumed with the legal battle for so long that she hadn't really taken time to think about what she wanted for her life. She had always been a caretaker, always worried about others. But now, it was time to focus on herself. She started small, picking up new hobbies, things she had always wanted to try but had never had the time or energy for. She began painting again, something she hadn't done since she was a child. She had always loved art, but had been pushed aside for so many years. Now, it was a way for her to express herself, to let out everything that had been bottled up inside her for so long. She also started working on new business ventures, setting up a foundation to help others who had been in situations like hers, people who had been controlled and manipulated. She knew how important it was to have a voice, to be able to speak out and make a difference. And with her new financial freedom, she could do just that. But even as she focused on her own growth, the memories of her time with Daniel lingered. They were still there, faint echoes in her mind. The hurt, the betrayal, the way he had used her. It was hard to forget, but Lila knew she couldn't let those memories control her anymore. She had to move forward, to embrace the person she was becoming. One evening, as she sat in her living room, staring at the fireplace, Lila received a call. It was Claire, the private investigator who had been with her from the beginning. "We've been keeping an eye on Daniel," Claire said, her voice calm but serious. "He's been making some move behind the scenes, trying to rally support for a final push. He hasn't given up, but we're on top of it. He won't get to you." Lila's heart skipped a beat. She had known it wasn't over. Daniel would never just let things go. But hearing it from Claire, hearing that he was still scheming, was a reminder that her fight wasn't fully over. "I'm not afraid of him anymore," Lila said, her voice steady. "He's lost. He knows it. I'm not going to let him have any more of my life." Claire paused for a moment. "I know you're strong, Lila, but just be careful. He's unpredictable. Don't let your guard down." Lila nodded, even though Claire couldn't see her. "I won't. Thanks, Claire." As the call ended, Lila sat back in her chair, deep in thought. She had won the battle, but she knew Daniel wasn't finished. He had never been one to accept defeat. But this time, Lila wasn't afraid. This time, she had the power, and she would make sure he couldn't take it from her. The next day, Lila spent hours at her father's old office, sorting through papers and taking inventory of everything he had left behind. The building was quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights above the only sound in the room. She had always felt a sense of peace here, but today it felt different. The office no longer belonged to her father. It belonged to her now. She opened one of the cabinets, pulling out a stack of files and going through them one by one. Her father had been meticulous, and everything was carefully documented. There were letters, contracts, and records of every business deal he had ever made. She had known that her father had been a successful man, but seeing it all laid out in front of her made it clear just how much he had accomplished in his lifetime. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the legacy he had left for her. He had given her everything she needed to succeed, everything she needed to build her own life. She just had to take it, to accept it, and to move forward. She had been given the tools. Now, it was time to build something with them. The days passed quickly, and soon it was time for Lila to make some big decisions. She met with her lawyer again to finalize the trust details and make sure everything was secure. She also continued working with her financial advisors, ensuring that her investments were sound and that her future was secure. But even as she focused on the practical aspect of her new life, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. The victory over Daniel, the legal battles, the money, it was all important, but there was still an emptiness inside her. She had gained so much. But what was it all for? She couldn't find peace within herself. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Lila decided to take a walk. The cool night air felt refreshing as she stepped outside, the sounds of the city surrounding her. She walked down the street aimlessly, not really knowing where she was going, but needing the time to clear her mind. As she walked, she thought about the past. She thought about the years spent with Daniel, the years spent trying to live up to his expectations. She thought about the way he controlled every aspect of her life and how she had let it happen. She had been weak then, afraid, but now she was strong, and she wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Daniel, control her again. Lila stopped by a small park and sat on one of the benches, the stillness of the night settling around her. The moon was full, casting a silver glow over the trees and grass. It was peaceful here. It was a place she could finally breathe, a place where she could just be herself. The following week, Lila received another message from her lawyer. This time, it wasn't about Daniel or the case. It was about her future. The final paperwork was ready to be signed, and everything was officially settled. Lila was free, completely free. She stood up in the chair, her heart racing as she realized the significance of it all. She had fought for this, had worked for this moment for so long, and now it was finally hers. She had the freedom to live her life the way she wanted, to build something for herself that no one could take away. With the paperwork signed and everything officially in place, Lila made a decision. She would sell the house. The mansion that had once held so many memories, so much pain, was no longer her home. It had been a symbol of her life with Daniel, and now she was ready to move on. She called her real estate agent and began the process. The house would be gone, but she would have the freedom to build something new, something that was truly hers. As the final chapter in her battle with Daniel came to a close, Lila felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had won, but more than that, she had reclaimed herself. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in her life, she was in control. She was ready to write her own story. Lila sat by the window in her new home, her gaze lost in the vast city before her. The light of the evening sun painted the buildings in shades of gold and pink, and for the first time in months, she felt a deep sense of calm settle over her. It wasn't just a view of the new surroundings. It was the peace she had fought so hard for. The storm had passed, and now, in its wake, there was only the quiet hum of her own life. The legal battle with Daniel had been a storm that seemed endless at times. She had fought for everything: her father's legacy, her financial freedom, and most importantly, her own voice. The victory in court had been sweet, but it was a journey that had truly changed her. Every moment of uncertainty, every challenge, every sacrifice had brought her to this point, and she was no longer the woman who had stepped into the courtroom months ago, filled with doubt and fear. She was a woman who had reclaimed her life. The phone buzzed beside her, snapping her out of her reverie. It was a message from Claire. Everything is quiet. Daniel has officially backed off. We're done. You've done it, Lila. Lila stared at the message for a moment, her fingers lightly tracing the words on the screen. She had known this moment would come, but now that it had, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like a new beginning. She stood up and walked over to the desk, pulling out the file that contained the final paperwork for the house. She had made the decision to sell it months ago, but the paperwork had taken time to finalize. As she signed the last few documents, a sense of finality settled over her. This house, which had been a symbol of everything she had lost, was now officially someone else's. It was no longer part of her past. It was a weight that had been lifted, a door that had been closed. And with that, another chapter of her life was behind her. The days that followed were filled with new opportunities. Lila threw herself into her work, focusing on expanding the foundation she had started. She spent hours meeting with donors, planning events, and working on initiatives that would help those who had experienced the same kind of manipulation and control she had. It was her way of giving back, of ensuring that no one else would have to suffer as she had. She also began to travel more, exploring places she had always wanted to visit, but had never felt free enough to enjoy. She walked the streets of foreign cities, took in the sights, and met new people. For the first time, Lila wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't worried about what Daniel might do next. She was free to be herself, to explore the world on her own terms. In the midst of it all, she began to rebuild her personal life. She reconnected with old friends, the ones she had lost touch with during the years of her marriage to Daniel. They welcomed her back with open arms, reminding her of who she was before everything changed. She had missed these connections, their laughter, their warmth, their genuine care. It was a reminder that she had never been truly alone, even when Daniel had made her feel that way. And as the months passed, Lila began to heal. The memories of her time with Daniel, the pain, the manipulation, the years of being trapped slowly faded. She had made peace with it all. The scars remained, but they no longer defined her. She had moved past it, and now she was building something new, something beautiful. One evening, as Lila sat on the balcony of her new apartment, watching the sun set over the city, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. She had come so far. The woman who had once been afraid, the woman who had allowed herself to be controlled, was no more. She had faced her darkest moments and emerged stronger, more determined, and more in control of her destiny than ever before. She had not just won in court. She had won the most important battle of all. She had reclaimed herself. The city stretched before her, its lights beginning to twinkle as night fell. She could hear the faint sounds of traffic, the laughter of people walking down the streets, the hum of life continuing as it always had. For the first time, Lila didn't feel like she was watching from the sidelines. She was part of it. She was part of this world, and it was hers to shape. She thought about the road ahead. There would always be challenges, always moments of doubt, but Lila knew now that she could face them. She had the strength, the wisdom, and the courage to continue forward. No one least of all Daniel could take that away from her. As the night sky deepened, Lila smiled to herself. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving, and that was all she had ever wanted.